Okay, so welcome to this Q&A session. So the first question someone had is, I recently read the PDF you shared about Dang training methods, which I found very interesting. I'd kind of always thought of the Dang as more or less the meeting point of the two Qua, but it seems like there's a whole specific area of training devoted to it. I'd love to know more about this and what some of these training methods look like. So I think, first of all, I should kind of clarify a bit what the Dang and the Qua are, because I'm not really sure if everybody knows. Yeah, but if we want to, I mean, this is a very simple illustration, of course. Yeah, but if we just want to like order the body into separate parts which all kind of interconnect, yeah, then we could of course say we have like the chest area, yeah, and which also of course connects the power with the power in the arms. And then we have the waist here, which is basically everything but the belly in this area, and more on the back, of course, yeah, but also the sides, but not really the belly. Yeah, this is what we call the waist in Taijiquan. And then, of course, we have the hips. It's basically the two joints on the two sides. So this is what in the question is called the Qua. Yeah. Or you could also call it like Quanguanjie, like the hip joints, but this basically this whole area is basically the Qua, but most importantly, it's the two hip joints. Yeah, but also it's a wider area. It's not a very precise anatomical language we use in the internal martial arts. And then we have the crotch, which is then the Dang. And I think it's a very interesting question because the Dang, I think it's not so often talked about, but it's like it has a huge impact on human movement. And in the Chinese martial arts, and especially the internal martial arts, it has it's very important. Now the crotch basically covers all this area between the Huiyin point, the perineum, and then it would be more on the inside of the legs, like where people kind of put together the trousers in the earlier days. Yeah, so if you have like the two legs, and then in the middle you sew something into it, and this is basically the Dang, the crotch area. Yeah. Now, if we want to differentiate it, we could also talk about a Hou Dang, like a back crotch, which would then be also connecting the buttocks. But also you could talk about a Tian Dang, which is like then the front crotch. Yeah, which is the first one I illustrated here. So as to the methods, I think it makes more sense to show. But now, if we like think of it as a progression, we would first start with what we call yuandang, like rounding the crotch. Yeah, so I mean, most of you training with me know this kind of thing. Yeah, so now we're kind of rounding the crotch, and it has this idea of a bridge in a way. Yeah, so you don't want to stand like this because now our weight would drop into the middle and burden or compress the knees quite a lot. Yeah, so of course we also don't want to be like too broad, so our big toes come up, but just broaden the crotch area. So we create some pungeon, some expansive force on the outer thighs. Yeah, so this basically, I think in the level 1, I would always recommend everybody like using this as a method. So if you go to the form, I don't know, any movement, yeah, you're kind of holding the crotch open. Yeah, this is like the yuan dang, and rounding the crotch. And then we could say in the second stage, we could say it's called in Chinese kai kwa he dang, which kai kwa means pulling open the hip joints. Yeah, because if you think about it, we are rounding it. So in a way, we are bringing force to the outside. So in a way, we are like opening the hip joints anyway, because of this first stage. It's just the first stage is just like more an external thing. Now in the second stage, we were like pulling it more open. So we increase the expansive force here, opening the hip joints. And then kai kwa he dang, which is like closing the crotch. So though we are opening here, we are also closing like the lower part, basically the knee joints to one another. And maybe you can see that it's like from a stance which is just like open and rounded, it's becoming more connected when we're like connecting the knees to one another and we can sit in more. Yeah. So now it's becoming more like a tensile kind of thing. Yeah. It's like open and then binding. You could also, sometimes they talk about binding the crotch, yeah, which I think would also be like even a higher level. So it's not only like horizontal connected, but also like in a spiraling way, more internally connected. Yeah. So now we have the closed dung, the closed crotch, and then in movement, and that would be a next stage, we can also slightly open it again. Yeah. So the front opens and the back closes, and then the front closes and the back opens. But I think the closing should really come first. So if you want to like see it as a progression, we're rounding it. In the second stage, we're closing it. And then in the third or fourth stage, we can also again open it, kind of. Yeah. So that would be yeah, some of the methods. Now we could go into more detail, like, for example, the perineum is quite important here, where the Huayin point is, because if we're just like relaxing it, our whole body will kind of become slack and kind of compress all the force downwards. So we kind of need to slightly lift it and then open it. And this also connects to the back dung opening and the front dung closing. And then when we have the movements, yeah, we're actually really connected in all these kind of stages in our body. Yeah, so if the dung, the crotch is not connected, and we're moving along, maybe you can see it's like the movement is a bit more sluggish in a way. Yeah, it's a bit less connected. The more we connect this force down here, the more connection we also have in the upper body. Yeah, we can use it in Fajin and all these kind of things. Yeah, so I hope this answers the question. It's a quite, I think it's a quite advanced question. So in this part, we're centering to the back, but the front, like the foot arch should be empty. You know, the foot arch, we call it like a flat foot, if the foot arch is not empty. And so if you have a flat foot and you put your weight down, of course you have no springiness, no liveliness in the foot. So this is why the Jungchen point, the bubbling well point, in the foot arch should be empty. Because now you're like kind of loading up your feet. And then you don't want to bring your weight again to the front. So basically, because then you're like stressing the structure which you just kind of energized, yeah? But you're like sitting back from it and bring your weight to where the heel is. So the heel is the most stable part, structurally speaking, in the foot. And then the front of the foot is more agile, gripping the ground. And it's more like the active part. So the front is more like the active part, the back is more like the passive part. And then you can basically load up your lower structure, and then it connects to the dungeon. You're perfectly right. And of course, you can always, there are always things you can do differently with a human body. And this is why all the Taijiquan styles differ also, you know? And also Chen-Stil differs quite a lot. And the more we don't go into detail, then you have like some systems which are like a really integrated whole. So all these little steps really like connect and come together. So if you build what I said, the crotch structure, the dung, on top of this foot structure, then it will develop into something really nice. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other question about this dung thing? Otherwise, we can go to the weight changes. Yeah, definitely. It's grounding you. It's if you don't have it, you're just not as grounded. And that's why, like, the very open stances we sometimes see are very problematic, because basically you're losing the crotch area. You cannot work with it. If you have a stance like this, you can try it out. it's basically your crotch is not connected. So you're not connecting your left and the right leg in a way. So this is why the stances have a certain parameter that they should work with, you know. So if you're sitting, of course, you can build up the connections from your sitting joints. But if you're standing, like in a car, yeah, you're probably sitting. So, but like if you're standing, you're perfectly right, because if you don't have this layer downwards, you kind of lost. Yeah, you're losing your stability. Yeah. Dantian, Danjong,
Okay.
Yintang.
Oh man. Okay.
A lot of points. Baihui, you know.
Good to know.
A lot of points which kind of do this. You could see the Dang in a way as a center in the lower body, and if you want to like view it that way. Okay.
Great, thank you.
So let's go to the next question, because I think it also it fits quite well into the first one. Why or when would we? I slightly changed some of the questions here, but I think the sense is still clear. Why or when would we choose or use a particular way of the 4 ways of weight transition? Which of the 4 ways to shift weight is more desirable versus one of the other 4 ways? Does the way we choose to shift weight have anything to do with application or other factors? And how would we know which to choose? Okay, so the question is, when we shift weight, we employ different kinds of weight changes here. I mean, there would be different ways how to categorize it, because there's no standard way here, but I learned from my teacher that in the way that I use the 4 ways. Some of my brothers, Kung Fu brothers, learned it slightly differently. Yet it doesn't really matter in the end. We can categorize it in a way like slightly differently, but I think these 4 ways are really nice, because if we think about it, if we just had a weight change, just like going to the left and the right, yeah, of course, our connections in the upper body would also be quite limited in a way, because if lower and upper body connect, and we are just always going to the same direction, you can't always, you know, there's a certain limitation in what powers you want to express. So this is why how the 4 weight changes come into play. I mean, the standard weight change is always the back arc, yeah? Going. So this is when you start learning to frame, this is basically what you should be doing. Yeah, because it's a very safe way. We can build up the leg forces, and we don't have the swimming knees, yeah, no lateral movement in the knees. So this is a very nice way. And in a way, you could also say all the forms are like an 8, yeah, but that's maybe another discussion. But so with these 4 movements, we have the possibility to like really express powers into all directions. And this is basically answering, hopefully, the question. You're pretty, at some point, you become pretty free. You should be working on the 4 powers, the 4 weights changes. Try and see what kind of forces they would promote in the room, yeah, in your space, in our space. And then at some point you become pretty free to use whatever Jin, whatever force you want to express to the outside. Yeah. So and then you can actually, sometimes you can use different ones, sometimes they kind of connect, or sometimes they, because they become very 3-dimensional, of course, they're not just staying 2-dimensional. So yeah, they become a bit more free. So it's more like a learning structure, I would say. Yeah, the 4 ways. But yeah, for example, if you're like pressing down, quite often you have like a shanghu, like a upward circle. Yeah, and then so it's really dependent on the powers, you want to express. Now, why I put it in after the crotch question, I think, is that, and I think that's a very interesting thing. In the Chinese literature, we usually find that the weight changes I remember when I was starting to learn Taichi, I always thought about it like, okay, it's weight, and then basically your hip joints are like bringing it there or there. Yeah. So it's more like we think about the bones a lot. But now if you think about it like the quad area, yeah, the hip joints and everything, that's the bone structure. Whereas the crotch is more like the tensile structure winding around the bones. So in a way, the weight changes at some stage should always be from the tensile structure. So it's like the connections are like bringing the weight over. Because you don't want to bring the bones over, yeah? Especially in the upward circle, you would see, okay, this is wrong. It's not very, like, it doesn't have any relation to force anymore, yeah? We are kind of breaking, like, disconnecting the body structure. But if you're just like using the tensile structure, then the bones are still maintaining their sitting quality, their sinking quality, but you can still like pull and have a lot of like tensile actions. So I think this is also a very interesting notion to understand that the weight changes are more from the crotch area and not so much from the hip joints. Yeah, of course they are pulling over the hip joints, but they're not being led by the hip joints. Yeah. Hope that was understandable or answered the question. And let me know if you have any additional follow-up questions. Cool. I hope it was understandable what I said. I'm working on increasing the Larsen tensile stretching during form training. Do you recommend anything staying like in fixed positions for each movement during the form in order to get the feel of the tensile stretching fully? This question, I mean, it has to do with everything what we said. It's just not only concerned with the crotch force, but it's more universal. So if somebody wants to work on the stretching, I think we have to think about the process of Sung Huo Tando, which is like Sung is like relaxing, Huo is like liveliness or mobility. Yeah, so these two things come first. So in the beginning, we need to relax. If we are just stiff and trying to pull something, we're not really going to succeed. Yeah, so we need to okay, you can't relax. Yeah. And then, of course, from relaxation comes mobility, because suddenly, okay, we can move the joints. Because if we're stiffening up, we're not really moving the joints. And truth be told, everybody has some habitual tensions, yeah, in the body, where we kind of stiffen up, where we have certain things which also cause stress to our body or to our mind. So we become a bit like tight or whatever. So these two stages, I think, really super important to put into practice first. You kind of relax and then, okay, feel the mobility of the joints. Now you can basically move everything. Yeah, so you can move the spine, you can move the hip joint, you can move the elbows, the shoulders, chest area. So, and then from these two stages, we can start to work on the stretching, on the internal stretching. So, and then I would say you can do it in the form, and you should, of course, stay long in positions, but they won't help us if we just start to not relax, keep the joints mobile, and then find the stretch from there. But we're just standing positions. I'm not so sure. So I would rather recommend like Sung, relax, Huo, lively, Tan. This is a tensile elastic connection. It's like the third stage, and I would work on it by stretching certain parts. Like, for example, from the left to the right hand, from pinky to pinky. Yeah? And then understand, okay, how the arms are connected via chest and back, you know? And then we can also connect on the front from thumb to thumb. Yeah, and then maybe on the back, pinky to pinky. So we can work on this connection and feel this tensile stretch, this internal stretch. And how, of course, all the shoulders, the elbows, everything kind of connects. And then, of course, we can do the same, for example, with Baihui, making the neck empty, opening Mingmen, finding our coccyx, tailbone, perineum. Okay, so now we have a vertical stretch, yeah, on the back. And then, of course, and then we can do all the stretches or the dung, the crotch stretch, yeah. And then I think if we have this feeling, then you can put it into the form. And then I don't even know if like standing postures, fixed postures, or slowly moving. I would probably recommend slowly moving, but I think we need this extra step of understanding how these things build up on one another and work on different body parts so we can then put it completely into the form. I hope the person who asked is not here, but if you guys have any follow-up. So someone said we won't make it through all the questions, but on our curriculum page, it looks like we've covered most of the body methods material in the Monday class. Basic requirements, movement methods, connections. The only one for sure I personally have not covered is bind and expand the ribs. What does that mean? And what is the feeling sensation that is trying to be produced, please? Okay, we have this idea of shu lei, it's called in Chinese. And lei is the rib or the rib cage, and shu, it means binding. So quite often we could say it's like shu lei he fu, and it means like binding the ribs and closing the belly. Yeah, so these two are connected. So if you think about it from the perspective of the body center, the dantian. Now we need to kind of, because there is no dantian, so we need to define dantian somehow from the sides, yeah, from the borders. So one border, of course, would be our two sides here. And binding the ribs basically means that we're like slightly pulling in this area, very slightly. Yeah. So we have this kind of connection from here to belly. Yeah? So there's a slight rounding also. And then when we're binding here, our belly cannot protrude to the front, but it's slightly, like the lower belly is slightly like bound, like it has a certain frame. Yeah. And so now when we breathe, our center will really feel very stable and full. Now, if we're not binding the rib cage and the belly protrudes, our diaphragm can't move properly, so we have more chest breathing. Yeah. So binding the ribs is basically meaning we're like pulling these two together, connecting chest to belly, and then we are more centered here. My teacher usually calls it doesn't call it like binding the ribs, but expanding the ribs. And for me, that would be a high level of binding the ribs, because binding, it could also mean to be like contracting, yeah, like becoming stiff like this. And this is not at all what we want to do, but we want to like keep the center, then binding here. And so it's more like the internal also kind of, oh, it's closing, connecting, it also kind of expanding. So then the internal expands, and then the rib cage becomes very, very nicely expanded and has some nice expansive force to the outside. It's not too easy to do, but I think maybe with these ideas you can work on it and incorporate it. Yeah. For example, also when you're like holding the arm up, pushing up, and you don't have the ribs connected at all, then the arm is just moving softly, but by itself. There's no connection. But if you're like, for example, you're lifting the arm, and then it's like pulling the rib cage, so the ribs can also kind of open, and then the arms comes in, and it can kind of close. Yeah, and that would also be like a movement, of course, from the rib cage. So once you've bound the ribs, you cannot again move it, of course. That's not binding and then being stiff. Yeah, but it's like finding a connection and then moving the connection. Yeah. Questions are really advanced today. If you have questions, just. If you do it, if you put out the hand like this, like you just did, yeah. Now you're kind of binding the rib cage, right? So you're like, basically you can even feel from the armpit on the outside, you can feel it running down on your chest and basically making dantian more stable, right? Now, if you're like turning the hand and you want to push upwards, so now your ribs are equally important, of course. But if you don't have them, okay, the arm is like floating, like you said. But if you're like stretching them out, the ribs, then you can feel, okay, now the hand is going upwards, but it's still kind of heavy and connected. And dantian has this connection because dantian kind of has to, like, feels like an internal rotation and then bringing the force upwards. So, like you say, the connection should always be there, but in the power changes, there's open closing in the connections. Yeah, the connections are never like, and then
Sure.
still. Yeah.
Okay.
What are some strategies to train through plateaus? Related, how does one judge their level in order to know what to focus on? That's a question I've been pondering a bit. I have a couple of answers, I think. I mean, a very simple answer would be if you have a plateau and you want to kind of leave it or you want to change something about the practice, basically it's best to ask your teacher, I would think. If you have a teacher, why not ask? Yeah. Then one thought also was, well, what's so bad about being on a plateau? I mean, if we go jogging every day, for example, we wouldn't ask ourselves, oh, am I not improving too much? It's becoming more like a habit, right? It's like, oh, okay, I feel good when I jog, so I go jogging. It doesn't need to be like every day the same distance, a minute less or something. It's kind of okay to have just like a practice which is you benefit from. So I think also to have a practice and you have a plateau, it doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. And a third answer would be maybe to, of course, define what you want to get better at, because then you can also find a solution yourself. So, and become more focused on single things to work on. I think that might also be really interesting. And of course, also with the help of a teacher, but like as you know, I'm a teacher who tends to overcoach a lot, bad habit. But I think in these, like if you're at a plateau and you want to kind of change something about it, the teacher should really say one key thing, and that should be your focus. And that should change a lot. So if you want to change a lot, I think you should just focus on one thing, and then the plateau will change, hopefully for the better. Yeah. So I think these would be kind of 3 things you could kind of try. That's an interesting question, but it's very individual also. Yeah. So if the person who asked this question would ask me, I would have a more definite answer, of course. So progression in internal martial arts. Oh, that's also basically fitting into this part. I just finished my book, but it's not published yet. But I put one part of the book is about progression in internal martial arts, and of course, mainly in our martial art. So I don't want to impose that thought on all internal martial arts, but I guess it could be similar in some ways. So if we think about like the kind of progression we can have, we can come from the the first level where we just work on external frame. Yeah, just working on trying to find the positions and this kind of thing, learning choreographies, even in the martial arts who pretend they don't have any choreographies. Basically everyone has one. So if it's like less or more choreography, it doesn't really matter. But I think the first stage is always about like settling in and doing the externals more. And then on the second level, I would think it's always about finding your root and finding your center to become the main pivot point of your body. And so if you have your center, the spine, and how it roots into the ground, then basically we have this, you can call it like a pole power, you know, where you have a tent and you just put in the main pole, and so you become quite stable. Yeah, and you can use this axis to create forces in this rotational kind of way. So if you're using this as a, you will probably be able to have very long forces, quite obvious forces, coming from a stable body axis. Yeah, so that would be the second stage. Then in the third stage, you could start to kind of use this concept to also expand in other dimensions, yeah, in like front, back, left, right. So you're kind of becoming more like the tent, you know, you're not only the one pole, but you're kind of using your skin to open and to create forces inside the room into all kind of directions. That would be like the third stage, and here we would be working more with the tensile actions in the body. And then in the fourth stage, we could turn this around. We have the tent, and then we can more work on filling the tent. Yeah, bringing in food, friends, drinking tea. So the tent is kind of expanding. Yeah, so this is more like the Neigong aspect. So like now the ini and the mind work becomes more important, or what we could see as qi, whatever. At that point, we need to kind of know what qi is, or what the feeling of qi is, and these kind of things. So that's more like the Neigong practice. And then in the fifth stage, we can forget about everything and just move freely again. And I think it's like learning stages. You can see it like plateaus while climbing a mountain, but I think you can also see it as training stages you can go through every day. Like you fall out of the bed, stand up, you find a position. It's like, oh, what happened yesterday? You know, okay, now it's like an external form, and then it's like, oh, okay, where you start, okay, the center, oh, okay, so that's second stage, you know, and then you can say, oh, now my body feels good again. You can expand a bit, you can become more, yeah, have more this quality, this pulling, expanding, sucking kind of quality. So it's like third stage, and then you can quiet down a bit and then work more from the internal to expand more and fill the frame more. So that would be fourth stage, and then you're kind of bored again, do something, just moving around again. So that's fifth stage. So it's in a way, it's like, could be like big plateaus, but I think it could also be like basically you could go through it in one training session, whatever your personal quality in that martial art is. But I think it's still, everybody has these things in ourselves anyway. Yeah. You asked me to make it short. I hope I did it shortly enough. So for a beginner, is it necessary to know the applications while practicing a form? There's enough cognitive load to maintain the principles of internal strength. I think that's a perfect order for the questions, actually. I think in level 1 and level 2, really, you don't have to think about applications too much, because you have to work with so many other things, like, for example, becoming centered. So now working on applications wouldn't really make too much sense. And then it would make more sense to start, like in the third stage, I would say you definitely need applications, because otherwise you won't understand the different forces, you know. Like you have a student and you say, oh, lifting up, but they might do something like this because they don't have the experience of lifting up something heavy, like a resisting arm. So you need to understand, okay, how is this application working? Because if you have something really heavy there, now you're just blocking your joint, but you need to kind of, you need to work on the rotational forces. Yeah, the silk reading, for example, and the opening and closing. So now you can move on a heavy object. So I think they really need applicational ideas and stuff. And so I probably from the third stage, it would be really interesting. And that's why in our frame, which is quite often taught already in like quite early, we put in ideas from the third level. Basically, we also start with application training quite in the beginning. But if you're working on the other levels, so the first and second level, I think you don't really need that. But there's also always an exception. Like if I have a student who's asking me about applications, I will always answer application questions. I will always go with the energy of the student. So if somebody asks me, they're usually also people who really need an external intention to understand the internal, like the external intention to understand the internal movement. So I will always be giving it to them. And then of course I might make very simple applications, but I will still teach applications right from the start. But but the question was, is it necessary? And I think it's not necessary. You definitely, at some point, you need applications. Otherwise, I think people are not honest with their own skill and with the teaching. I think you need applications. From level 3 training, you need it. Otherwise, it won't work. You can't say, oh, it's... but the question was finished, Joe. I think I didn't go over time.
Sorry.
Oh, no. Oh, no, now you made me lose my challenge. No, it's really, at some point you need applications, but in the beginning, of course, the applications are always, they are working around a certain body method. So if you start with applications right from the start, some fear might be that people are working on the external results, but they don't have any internal understanding. So they might just use brute force and then stay with it forever. And of course, that fear can be grounded, but it can also be ungrounded because, of course, you can refine it later. Yeah. So I think it's both are in a way correct, but at some point you need applications because otherwise you will never be able to understand the forces inside the room. You know, how to connect to the outside. Why, for example, the internal, like the internal pivot point, yeah? Why is this really beneficial to create forces to the outside? Yeah, because of course, you're driving the force from your internal body. It's much more powerful than doing something like this, you know? So of course, the internal work and the external should always connect. It's always both. And this is why we could start more from here and then harmonize it more later with here. But to think, oh no, you were only working on this, and then at some point this will happen by itself, I don't think it's correct. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, guys. Perfect in timing. No minute overtime. No second overtime. I think it was perfect. So really, I hope it was enjoyable. I enjoyed it hanging out with you guys. And yeah, let me know if you find it useful, then we can proceed it. Otherwise, we find a different format. It was good seeing you guys.